This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In today's episode, I'm joined by garden writer Rhonda Fleming Hayes to explore how our relationship with gardening changes as we age and why staying connected to nature matters so deeply. From rethinking sprawling borders and high-maintenance planting schemes to discovering the joy of balcony gardens, community plots, and simply slowing down enough to truly appreciate a garden, this is an uplifting conversation about adapting rather than giving up.
I've been gardening since I was a small child, following my grandmother around. I think that's how a lot of us start gardening. And then my first own garden of my own was in college, and I grew things out the back door of a rental house. And then what happened was I married a man who was subject to transfer, and we became corporate nomads. And so I've gardened in Kansas, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and even in England. Well, I was in England, but I don't think I gardened. I just looked and stored up inspiration.
So, how did you get into writing? Is it something you've always done?
Well, I've always been writing and I've always been gardening, but I never thought to put the two together until right after my son, my last one, went to college. And I found myself wanting to do something, with all that time. And I started writing about gardening, and it was like, oh, why didn't I do that sooner?
Makes sense. I mean, I was talking to someone about this the other day, actually, and we were saying that writing and gardening do seem to go a bit hand in hand. And I don't know if it's because we make a lot of records and things, or some of us do, when it comes to plants and seasonal changes and things. But yeah, they do seem to work well together. So how did you come to write about gardening as you age specifically?
Well, it was several reasons. Being a garden writer, I get to see all these beautiful gardens and meet all these amazing gardeners. And I started thinking, oh, they've mostly got gray hair. Some of the best gardens, they're gardeners who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they were just so inspiring. It's like they've found the fountain of youth, but it's a garden. And these people, they're active, they're grounded, they're curious, and they're open to learning new ways to use their garden and enjoy their garden. And then it was also the fact that you learn so much about how good gardening is for you. But at the same time, I started hearing from a lot of my fellow garden writers, fellow gardening colleagues, that they'd made these beautiful gardens and they were starting to get to the point where they couldn't do all the care and the maintenance, and they were becoming overwhelmed and they felt guilty or they felt sad about it. And I thought, well, how can we address the challenges and the joys of gardening as we age?
Yeah, that's a really good premise for a book because, as you say, there are really lots of positives, but then some things naturally become, if not more difficult, then certainly, we have to adapt things and change the way that we do things. So on the positive note, why is gardening good for you to do as you get older?
Well, there's the physical side. It offers what they call variety of movement. There's this variety of natural movement as you're going through the process. And it's just not one movement, it's all these different ones. You're using your large muscles for digging and planting and raking, things like that. And then you're also using your hands. And so those are your fine motor skills, your deadheading, your pruning, snipping, harvesting, things like that. So there's that whole physical side. But then, they call it a full mind-body workout. And there's the de-stressing part of it because, you go out there and you just kind of get lost in it. And so you're doing all this movement, but you're not counting reps like you're in a gym, So there are cognitive benefits and, things like it's said to boost your immunity and lower your blood pressure, things like that. So there's just that overall health improvement.
Yeah, I was interested in the brain health part of it. It's something I think that probably hadn't struck me, but there are a lot of ways that it's good for you because it does challenge your brain. It makes you think, in different ways. It's maybe an overlooked positive benefit to gardening.
When you're gardening, there's just a series of decisions, and you might not even think of them as that way, but you're thinking sun or shade, loam or sand, different, soil, light. And then you're thinking about all the different varieties because, as we say over here, right plant, right place. And so there's this constant thinking about how can I do this better or things like that.
And thinking about how we might need to adapt, there are lots of changes that occur. And there's a brilliant quote in the book that I think it originated from somebody else, but it's something along the lines of old age is always 15 years older than I am. So aging is kind of it's an ongoing process, and you are just at different stages throughout your life. So you're not, when you're 30, you're not doing what you were doing when you were 16. So, there's always this kind of just things evolve, and the way that you work within a space evolves. Did you have like a cut-off point for kind of saying, right, well, I'm going to write about people over the age of, say, 50, because that's where I feel the most changes happen?
Well, I think we targeted 55 and up just because that's an age where people start thinking about retirement. And there are lots of changes going on in people's lives as they start going towards 60, where you may be retiring, you may have grandchildren, you may want to travel. It's not like we're slowing down anymore as we age. It's like we're opening up to all these new activities. And so, where are you going to prioritize gardening with that? And I didn't want people to just give up on gardening. I hear so many people go, oh, we moved to a condo and we don't have any yard work anymore. And I think, well, that's sad. Because you want to be connecting with nature in some way, and you don't have to give up gardening just because you only have a patio or a balcony or something like that. So, keeping in mind all those changes, and then at the same time, your garden is changing. Trees grow up, trees come down, shrubs get overgrown, things like that. Your tastes change. So, change is the big word right there.
And also, going back to what you were saying there about the size of your garden, for some people, they've taken on a larger garden because they're so in love with gardening, and it seems like a brilliant idea. And I know loads of people that have done this. And as the kind of years go by, they think, okay, well, that brilliant garden that I could manage just about when I was maybe fitter or had more time, was a great idea. But now it's becoming the problem. It's a genuine problem for some people. And you have to look at ways of kind of adapting it. And I guess the most obvious way, and a lot of people do it, is to downsize in terms of the house and garden. But if that isn't an option, what are the other things that people might be able to do?
Well, one of the strategies we talked about is, first of all, the idea is that I don't know what the percentage over there is, but here a survey said that 77% of people over 65 want to, what they call, age in place in their homes. And so you can adapt a home for aging, but it's not as easy to adapt a garden because things are always growing, things are changing, the weather's out there. So one strategy was to try to break the garden down into zones and to ask yourself, how many cultivated areas do you really need? And then to concentrate those most intensely cultivated areas closer to the house. One, so that, you're not traveling back and forth with all these trips up and down the garden. And second of all, so that you can appreciate your efforts from inside the house at the same time as outside. And then as you move further out into the garden, to try to make those areas lower maintenance. One of the things I talk about is maybe reducing the number of perennials and replacing those with flowering shrubs. There are so many different flowering shrubs now in different sizes that you can almost recreate that perennial garden look with shrubs. But shrubs are like a one-touch plant. You might, trim a little bit or, prune off a branch or something. But, there's no deadheading, dividing, cutting back involved. And there's so many that have beautiful blooms, autumn color, things like that, that you're not going to really miss out on, interest in the garden.
No. And do you think that it might be sensible to put aside a budget to do things like that? Because obviously, if you are overhauling the garden it could be a gradual process, but if you're already at that stage where you're looking to change the garden, you might also be at that stage where you're not so capable of making those changes.
Yeah, you've hit it on the nail there. And so, it may be that you have to hire someone to help with that if you've left it late in the game, maybe somebody that can come in and arrange it in that way. It doesn't hurt to have like a 1-hour consult with a landscape designer or landscape architect to let them look at your garden through their eyes. They're trained to see how people move through the garden and how you can do things like that with reducing maintenance. And so it may be if you're thinking ahead in your 50s, you might start thinking in those terms already, gradually removing overgrown things like that. But yeah, sometimes it does catch you out, and that is tougher. And you may have to hire that done if you can. Every garden is different. It's really hard. There's no one shot answer there.
No, I guess there's not. And I guess it depends on the size and what your garden's already got in it. But, I suppose there are ways of making it, as you say, lower maintenance. So perhaps if you had a really intensive maybe veg patch, or you've done a lot of container gardening with annual plants, you might just want to think about replacing them. I know you mentioned the hydrangeas in your garden, which I sadly parted with, but found better alternatives. So
Yeah.
that's a way forward. What did you do with your hydrangeas?
I replaced them with a different kind of hydrangea. I started out with Annabelle hydrangeas. Are those common over there?
Yes.
Okay. On my street, I'm in a historical neighborhood, and a lot of the homes are from around 1910 to 1930s. They're the style that we call craftsman four squares. And it seems like so many of them on the street have the Annabelle hydrangeas. And so when we built this home, we took great pains to make the house look like it had always been here. And one of the things I did was an homage to the Annabelle hydrangeas. And I had them out there, and they were gorgeous. They got big and lush, but the way our roof is designed, I didn't want to have gutters on the house, and so the water slides right off on top of them, and they're always flopping and, on that first rain, and it was like, oh, and I'd go out there, especially if I had garden tours, and I'd go out there trying to shake the water off of them, and, it's like, oh, she's out there shaking her hydrangeas again. And it just got tiresome. I tried to stake them up, and they looked even worse. And so I took the big decision to have them replaced. But what I found was a hydrangea called Bobo, and I hate that name, but they have much stiffer stems, a more of a conical type shaped bloom. They don't have that big a wow factor, but they're still very attractive. And they stand up to that rainfall that comes off the roof. I don't have to shake my hydrangeas anymore.
It's a genuine consideration, isn't it? Especially if you're working as a garden designer or, landscape architect. If you're
Mhm.
designing for a space that is going to be used by people who are older, then you need to think about these things. I guess you need to future-proof the garden, or even make it so that it is suitable for whatever age is in there.
Yeah, I think future proof is a really good idea. And going back to that quote about old age being 15 years older, as I was writing the book, I was not just writing about gardening, I was studying and researching aging and thinking about my own attitudes towards aging. And, in your mind, you may be 20 years, 15 years younger, in your mind, but, your body is betraying you at the same time. And no matter how fit you are, you're going to get creaky joints. You're going to lose some stamina and everything. And so that's hard to accept. And it's hard to imagine your garden into the future. So I talk about evaluating it and trying to think about how you might move and feel in 15 years.
You talk about climate change in the book and about plants for climate change, but one of the things that I thought about reading it was we do have rising temperatures. We do here in the UK for sure. And I'm guessing as well, as you become older, your ability to cope with the heat becomes more tricky to regulate. Is that something that you need to think about as well in your garden?
Well, I definitely think about it because I'm very sensitive to the heat. I would fit right in over there in England or maybe up in Scotland even. I have very freckly, fair skin, and I'm the heat. I'm a delicate flower, and I wilt. Even here, I live in a northern state, but we still have warm, hot summers. And I find that I just can't tolerate the heat anymore. So I time my work in the garden for mornings and evenings, things like that. But there's a scientific reason behind it, is that as you age, you lose sweat glands, and you just, as my doctor puts it, your thermostat doesn't work as well as it used to.
So, if you don't have a garden as well, this is something else you mentioned in the book, and that is if you perhaps moved out of your accommodation, you might need to look at ways of gardening without having a garden anymore.
Are you speaking about just having like a patio or a courtyard or something like that? Are you talking about gardening standing up or sitting down inside or?
Yes, all of the above, I suppose.
Okay.
There's lots of different options. And what I was thinking about, and I made notes about, was indoor gardening. Then you've got assisted living. Then you've got volunteer and kind of public gardening. So you don't necessarily need to stop gardening if you've moved somewhere that doesn't have its own space.
Yeah, I have several gardening friends that moved from quite large gardens to townhouses. And I started talking to them about what they had done and what challenges they had. And so in writing the book, I want to walk the walk, just not talk the talk. So I took my back patio out my back door and said, okay, pretend this is the only place I can garden. So I did 3 different things. I used a Vigo elevated garden bed. It's like a very, what is it, 2x4 bed that is raised up, and it's on wheels, actually. Real attractive, fun thing. It's the one that's on the cover of the book, actually. And so I just packed that elevated garden full of hummingbird plants. You don't have hummingbirds, do you?
No, we have
You don't.
hummingbird moths. That's the closest.
Oh, well, that's too bad. But anyway, so I was trying to attract hummingbirds with lots of salvias and different things like that. And so it was a pleasant experience not bending over, just standing there and tending this little garden. I would go out there and deadhead and kind of primp the plants. And then when I was inside, I could stand in my kitchen window and watch the hummingbirds flitting all about. And I thought, okay, if all I had was a small patio, that's a pretty satisfying gardening experience. And then the other thing I took was, with the brand over here, is a green stalk vertical planter. And so it goes upward, it's a circular arrangement, and there's 30 pockets to plant plants in. And so I planted just kind of what I had left over from my kitchen garden. I put in some strawberries, some shallots, green beans, and then I kind of softened it up with a little bit of alyssum. And so it's this vertical experience, and it turns around kind of like one of those card display things in a store. And once again, if I only had a tiny balcony, that wasn't a bad experience. And you could maybe put 2 or 3 in one space. And I was able to harvest, modest amounts of produce from there, some strawberries to put on my Cheerios in the morning, things like that. So there are ways to garden in a smaller space. Obviously, it's not going to be huge, but when you reach a certain age, it might be just right.
Yeah, and actually, it's a sad fact that your senses decrease. So if your eyesight is getting worse, you might want things up closer, and ditto your smell, I guess,
Oh, yeah,
at
definitely.
sort of eye level where you can get up close and personal with them.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there's all these things to consider.
Well, that's it. When I started writing the book, it just, the topic got broader and broader.
Yeah. Well, how much you take for granted, I think, when you're younger and you don't, you
Oh,
just.
definitely.
So the other thing that you mentioned was, when you're thinking about your garden space outdoors and you are perhaps considering adapting it or making it more user friendly for what you need, you spoke about how you should think about what you're using your garden for. And again, I guess that means if you've stayed put in a space, it could be that, you had areas dedicated to children's games, or, perhaps you did something that you needed more space to do. And then as you get older, you might want to incorporate more seating. So thinking about the sort of circulation around your garden and the actual zoning it, as you say, and what you're going to use it for is very important, isn't it?
Yeah, gardeners, we love plants, and the minute we think of a problem, we think of the answer being more plants, more plants. But at some point, maybe the answers are more with hardscape. Perhaps you want to make sure that you have paths out into your garden so that you can just go out there and appreciate it instead of just working in it. Because, you're trying to find that sweet spot where the garden is not a chore and it's more a joy. And where does that line hit? I think that having it where it's more accessible, maybe there are more seating areas so that you get out there more and just enjoy it. Perhaps, maybe you start taking meals out there or something like that. Some people make little destinations around their gardens where they do different activities, like they have a spot further away from the house where they do yoga in the morning out amongst the birdsong, things like that. And then other ways to put in things that don't require deadheading dividing, like a patio pond or a little games area, something like that. Art in the garden. So you're still enhancing the garden, but you're not creating more work.
And I did wonder if you recommend at any point, is it an option that to just really leave areas to kind of go wild? And I think this might be more of an aesthetic that we're warming up to in the UK. I don't know if for maybe cultural or practical reasons it's as common in the States, but we may just basically fence off or rope off an area and say, right, whereas I was tending that meticulously, I'm actually going to let that do its own thing now. But that seems like it could be a solution.
Well, that's very popular over here too. I believe you call it rewilding over there.
We do.
Yeah. And so I think that a lot of people, if they have larger properties, they're creating meadow gardens or prairie gardens, things like that. Native plant areas where they're not tending them as intensively as they might. And a lot of that does depend upon your type of neighborhood, where your property borders are. But I know that I'm in the city. I'm in a strange situation where it's urban, but it's very woodsy, to use that word over there. There's a lot of wooded park areas and things like that. So it's easy for me to let the edges of my property go wild. And so at the back of my property, I don't really step in there. The dog likes to run around in there, but I have lots of native plants and they're growing in shady situations back there under trees. And it just kind of runs itself. I really don't do any type of maintenance back there. So yeah, letting things go wild around the edges is what I guess I would call it.
And what are your thoughts on lawns? Yes or no, as maintenance becomes more of an issue?
Well, there's the good and the bad. I mean, lawns obviously are more enjoyable than concrete, paving, things like that. And they give our eye a place to rest in the landscape. And we do have places where we need lawns for kids to play, for dogs to run, things like that. But there's a lot of lawns over here that are just huge and nobody steps foot in them except to ride the lawnmower around. And so there have to be ways to reduce lawns because that's an expensive thing if you hire it out, and it's a time-consuming thing if you do it yourself. And after a while, it can wear on you. So there are, over here, people are using ground covers or they're using different lawn mixes. Like we have bee lawns where we plant a lawn that can grow longer and flower and not need mowing except maybe once a year or something like that.
I mean, there are adaptations, and I have to say your book was excellent, and you'd really dug into the topic and thought of a lot of solutions and workarounds, which was, it's nice. It's nice to see that written about because it's an aspect of gardening that's not always considered. How confident are you that for most people as they age, they can still get that nature contact, they can still have a garden that's manageable using your solutions, obviously, but also in general, is that something you think is attainable for a lot of people?
I think that everybody has a different shaped garden. They're all very unique, but I think that a lot of the strategies that I use, I think that you can still try to maintain some kind of connection with nature out your back door. I think if you happen to decide to downsize greatly, or even if you go to what we call a retirement community, assisted living, there are still opportunities. If you go to a smaller place and you just feel like you still want to garden, a lot of my friends have community gardens, which you refer to as allotments over there. Quite a few people go and, like, if they don't have a sunny spot in their residential area here, they'll go and grow vegetables in their community plot. And they find that very satisfying to go out and do something like that. And that kind of scratches the gardening itch.
Through my work, I do a lot of work in a home where there's elderly residents. It's a residential care home. And a lot of them mention their garden, and a lot of them talk about outdoor nature experiences when they're reminiscing. And a lot of people really miss their garden. And I'm wondering if there's a way of sort of reframing that in your mind as, it was an amazing thing to do. It was an amazing thing to have, and whether we need to come to terms a little bit more with the fact that perhaps one day we may be in a situation where we've got photographs of our gardens, and some of them go and get the photographs and they show them to us, which is amazing. But, maybe we need to kind of remind ourselves to A, live in the moment a little bit when we are lucky enough to be in the garden, and B, think about gardening as something that hopefully will always be there. But if it's not, maybe we need to put a positive spin on it and think, oh, wow, I had so many good decades in my garden, and it is what it is.
Well, I always tell my daughter, when I get really, really old and I can't grow my kitchen garden anymore, let's just go on those little trips where you wheel me around the garden center or you wheel me through the botanical garden, and we just look at it and appreciate it from there. So even if you can't physically garden, I think there are still ways to maintain contact with nature like that. And it is good to reminisce about that. And if you're in a botanical garden, one of the best ways to remember your garden is through fragrance, the smells of different flowers and plants. That evokes lots of good memories.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Rhonda for such a thoughtful and uplifting conversation. If today's episode has got you thinking about the ways gardening supports us through different stages of life, you might also enjoy episode 366, Universal Qualities of Healing Gardens, and episode 325, Growing in the Garden. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week.
The rose chafer beetle, scientific name Cetonia aurata. This week's insect of the week is a magnificent, metallic, iridescent green, jewel-like beetle. I've been seeing quite a lot of these at the minute, so I'm hoping you are too. The etymology, scientific name Cetonia aurata. So Cetonia comes from ancient Greek, loosely translating as a large beetle or scarab. Aurata comes from Latin, meaning golden, relating to its appearance. And this is a fascinating beetle in its adult form, but I think more so with the larval stage, the grub stage. The adults feed on flowers, often see them on all sorts of flowers, drinking nectar. Apparently they're very common on dog roses according to the literature, but I see them on all sorts of garden plants. And the larvae, the grubs, this is where I think they're really interesting. They're detritivores, so they feed on detritus in soil. They don't feed on living plant matter, which is really important. So they won't be eating your plants. Now, in my opinion, this is the most common beetle grub, large white beetle grub that I find in soils. So for gardeners who often come across beetle grubs, this is really the most common one you're likely to find. And it's not eating your plants. So really important. People do panic because some of the chafer grubs will actually eat the roots of grasses and whatnot. So in your lawn, they might be having an impact. But I don't find those to be as common as this rose chafer beetle, in London anyway. So the kind of habitats you might find them in, grasslands, scrubs, gardens, woodland edge. But the places that I typically find them as compost heaps, potted plants and planters. So when you're changing the bedding plants over or repotting, turning the compost heap over, that's where I tend to find them. And as I kind of mentioned, some people conflate them with things like summer chafers, which the larvae will eat the roots of grasses. Now, there is an amazing guide online actually by a lady called Maria Fremlin, and she's in a gardener's guide for the larvae, and this includes all the stag beetles as well. So the kind of the crucial thing with this one, if you do come across the grub, it's quite chunky white, got a smaller head than it has a large bum, which she kind of points out. They got these little kidney-shaped marks on the spiracles, but what's quite useful, if you put one of the grubs down on a surface, it'll crawl on its back, and that's a good way to separate it from like a cockchafer, which will crawl on its front. So the behavior can be a way of separating them as well. Anyway, I hope you find this as interesting as I do, but that's how you can identify the grub. And like I say, in my opinion, this is the most common one that I come across in gardens, and it's not eating living plant material, so it's just a detritivore. So quite a useful one in a soil capacity. The much rarer noble chafer is an extremely close doppelganger, but unless you're looking at old orchards in like places like Worcestershire, you may not come across this. So once again, if you do take really good photos, you should be able to still just about make out the differences between this one and that. But that is a possible confusion species. If you find that one, I've never seen one of those before. They're very rare and cool. So as always, please do record on the apps if you see them, even though they are quite common. I record on iNaturalist, and do tag me in if you see one.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.